Departmental seminar. Today's speaker is Dr. Brittany Jock. She is an assistant professor at the Center for Indigenous Peoples Nutrition and Environment at the School of Human Nutrition at McGill University. Dr. Jock obtained her bachelor's degree from Syracuse University in chemistry, and she also holds master's degrees, master's degree in epidemiology and a doctorate in social and behavioral interventions from Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. She focuses on the design and application of mixed methods research and development, implementation, and evaluation of health programs. Her research also combines epidemiology with social and behavioral sciences to respond to obesity and chronic disease inequities experienced by Indigenous nations and communities. And her research really focuses on responding to the dietary shift from Indigenous tribal food systems to highly processed market food systems that resulted from the ongoing colonization of Turtle Island. And she's also a member of the Bear Clan from the Akwesasne territory. And with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Jock.
Nyawa, thank you, Dr. Kwanda-Lacey. I'm very happy to be here and to talk about this really exciting topic that is near and dear to my heart and the way that I go about my research on Indigenous peoples' food and environments and obesity prevention. And I'll be talking about data ownership, participatory approaches, and mixed methods with a focus on how this can apply with research with BIPOC or Black, Indigenous, people of color communities. So first, let's see, advance the slides. Okay. So first, I want to acknowledge the traditional territories where I am and where you all are on the School of Public Health. First, I'm presenting from Akwesasne, which is Mohawk Kanien'kehá:ka Reservation in upstate New York and spans the borders of New York, Ontario, and Quebec. And on campus, where you all are, is the traditional territory of the Sioux Nation, the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho nations, and want to acknowledge the traditional stewards of this land and their contributions to our current societies. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about data ownership, and I'm going to start with a bit of some context of Indigenous peoples in Canada and the United States. So Indigenous peoples in Canada are representing 1.67 million people in Canada, and this is a very diverse group. In Canada, it's recognized 3 distinct Indigenous populations, including 630 First Nations communities. This is similar to Native Americans in the United States, along with Inuit populations and Métis. This is, of course, a very diverse group. For example, the 630 First Nations are representing over 50 distinct tribes or nations and 50 languages. In the United States, Native Americans are representing 5.2 million people, and combined the tribal territories of the over 576 federally recognized tribal nations are representing 100 million acres of land under tribal control, making Native America the 4th largest state in the United States. What is distinct about these populations is that it's not just a racial or ethnic group, that these tribes, and particularly in the United States, have a unique government-to-government relationship with the United States that was established through treaties. And these treaties are recognizing the inherent sovereignty of these nations, and which is including the ability to govern, protect, and promote the health and welfare of tribal citizens living on the territory. And so it's not just a group, it's really a political and part of the fabric of governments that is part of the US government system. There are important policies that are impacting the health status of Indigenous peoples. First, in Canada, the Indian Act is a piece of legislation that has had broad impacts on Indigenous peoples, particularly for First Nations people living in Canada. This has resulted in forced relocation to reserves, similar to reservations in the United States, and was part of introducing and requiring residential schools as the mandatory educational required educational system. But this system, like the boarding schools in the United States, had a nefarious purpose. The express purpose was to kill the Indian and save the man. So they were designed to take children away forcibly from their families and their communities, ship them away, oftentimes hundreds of miles away from their community, where they experienced quite a bit of abuse and experienced abuse, particularly in terms of expressing their culture, but also experienced physical, emotional, and sexual abuse while attending these boarding schools, which were enacted by the Canadian government. So you can see Duncan Scott Campbell, the happiest future for the Indian race is absorption into the general population. And this is the object of the policy of our government. The great forces of intermarriage and education will finally overcome the lingering traces of Native customs and traditions, and therefore address this Indian problem that the Canadian and US governments had. So the express purpose was cultural genocide and to solve this Indian problem. And this is a quote from an advocate of the residential school system. Similarly, in the United States, there are large policy drivers impacting the nutrition transition or transition away from traditional food systems towards these highly processed foods, but they're also having huge impacts on contemporary Indigenous health status. These include the forced relocation to reservations, which is shown in this GIF, the reduction of tribal territory and loss of tribal territory. The enactment of boarding schools similar to residential schools in Canada. They were modeled after each other with the same purpose of killing the Indian and saving the man. And in the United States, this tradition of food assistance to tribes, which really was in response to the relocation and limiting to reservations, and meant that people couldn't participate in their traditional food systems. But this meant that there was a high amount of severe undernourishment. And so the US government responded by providing food rations to tribes, which really were not culturally appropriate and encouraged access to highly processed foods such as sugar, flour, and salt, and impacted health status. So these policies have, as I mentioned, a great impact on Indigenous health status, but are important to understanding the ways that we interact with these communities and understanding their history, particularly with outsiders coming in to, even do something that is supposed to be a good thing, right? Getting education. So this is kind of the mindset that communities have. This is the experience of Indigenous communities, and so you can kind of start to see how we should be thinking about approaching these Indigenous communities. What is a little different about the Canadian side is that the Canadian government formally apologized and recognized its role in the residential school system. And I'll play a short excerpt of this apology that was from 2008. And I'll just make sure I can share sound.
Mr. Speaker, I stand before you today to offer an apology to former students of Indian residential schools. The treatment of children in Indian residential schools is a sad chapter in our history. In the 1870s, the federal government, partly in order to meet its obligations to educate Aboriginal children, began to play a role in the development and administration of these schools. Two primary objectives of the residential school system were to remove and isolate children from the influence of their home, families, traditions, and cultures, and to assimilate them into the dominant culture. These objectives were based on the assumption that Aboriginal cultures and spiritual beliefs were inferior and unequal. Indeed, some sought, as was infamously said, to kill the Indian in the child. Today, we recognize that this policy of assimilation was wrong, has caused great harm, and has no place in our country.
So that is a short excerpt from that apology, and you saw there were Indigenous representatives on the floor that day to hear that formal apology, many of whom were attendees of the residential schools in Canada. So because in response to this apology and these residential schools were open and operational in the United States and Canada through the early 90s, let me do a new share. They were operational through the early 90s, and the last one in Canada was closed in 1996. You know, this sounds like something that wouldn't happen in our lifetimes, and like it's very distant history, but it's something that was still occurring in my lifetime as an Indigenous person. And so, you know, we can understand how these are still having impacts on people's health in a variety of different ways. In response to this formal apology, this launched a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada that responded to these, sorry, just having some problems with sharing notes here. Let's see. So Truth and Reconciliation Commission was launched in response to this formal apology. And so Truth and Reconciliation is very much a different piece in Canada. In the United States, there was not a formal apology, though President Obama put in some recognition of the harms of boarding schools, but it was not a formal apology that recognized the role of the federal government, and it was buried into another piece of legislation. So it wasn't this public event that required this response from the government because of their responsibility. So Truth and Reconciliation in Canada is about establishing and maintaining this respectful relationship and healing this and reconciling this relationship that was started through treaties between Aboriginal people and settlers, and this, you know, what was supposed to be this harmonious relationship and restoring that relationship. And so for reconciliation to happen in Canada, there is this recognition that there has to be awareness of the past, an acknowledgement of the harm that has been inflicted, and atonement for the causes and action to change behavior. And so this has caused the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has issued 94 calls to action that span across Canadian society. And so we can think about how research also fits within this, that we think about the dynamics, understanding this history, in the United States and Canada, and understanding how we should be reconciling these relationships even within the research enterprise. So the First Nations and Information Governance Center developed these, has been really one of these groundbreaking institutions in Canada that is recognizing that First Nations people and Indigenous people in Canada really need to have control over their data. I'll show a quick video clip from them.
First Nations people have always understood the value of community, the importance of respect, and the need to protect our resources for future generations. And today, one of our most important resources is information. First Nations people have always been information gatherers. When we track and hunt or gather food from the land, we're engaging in information gathering that has a direct and important impact on our lives. First Nations people understand that information isn't just about numbers and surveys. It's about culture, identity, traditions, and self-determination. That's why the First Nation Information Governance Center was created. Since 1996, its mission has been to uphold the values of OCAP, a set of principles designed to protect First Nations ownership and jurisdiction over their information, and ensure that First Nations.
So the OCAP principles that were alluded to in that document are this response to colonialism and the role of knowledge production in reproducing colonial relations, and is actually occurring in response to this Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So it's looking at these dimensions of data governance, including ownership. So nations collectively own their information, control that nations and representative bodies are within the rights to control all aspects of research and information which impact them, that nations have access to information about themselves and their communities, regardless of where it is held, and possessions. So nations need to have a mechanism so that they can assert their ownership and possession of that data. And this applies to research, monitoring and surveillance, surveys, statistics, and cultural knowledge. So it's all-encompassing and is becoming the standard for how to do research with Indigenous communities in Canada, but there's also growing recognition in the United States of applying these principles for Indigenous communities. So why focus on dimensions of data ownership? It's in response to these policies, but also even more specifically, the history of research abusing power in these, the use of Indigenous data. And for example, the Havasupai tribe, there was the Havasupai Diabetes Project was being implemented. The tribal members of Havasupai reached out to Dr. John Martin, who is an anthropologist, and they wanted to understand, what is going on with the high rates of diabetes in their community. And he had well-established good relationships with the community, and he said he could help them in 3 different ways. So first, to provide education, second, to arrange for diabetes testing, and also to examine genetic risk factors. So to do that, he brought in a collaborator, Dr. Teresa Markow, and she had this interest in expanding the research topic to include schizophrenia, inbreeding, and the origin of these genetic origin and genealogy of where these peoples came from. None of these were included, when she mentioned this to Dr. Martin, the person who had these relationships with the Havasupai tribe, he said that they would not be interested, but be interested in this really narrow scope. They applied for and received a grant to do this study, And Dr. Markow separately applied for and received a grant to study schizophrenia among tribal members without tribal permission or inclusion in the consent forms. So this data, in order to work with the tribe, they collected over 200 blood samples from the Havasupai tribal members. And these blood samples were very culturally significant to the tribe. They believed it, held a piece of people's spirit, and these samples were abused by looking at these other topics that the tribe did not agree to, and that caused a lot of harm to people. By looking at, schizophrenia and inbreeding completely outside of the topic of diabetes and really sensitive topics. So this created, of course, legal consequences because of this and this misuse of data. And created, quite a long consequence over 6 years of legal battles, a settlement agreement with Arizona State University. And this meant that the blood samples were returned, that there was a settlement payment to tribal members, but there was still damage after this. Many of the participants had passed away, and so it caused a lot of pain for the individuals and the community as a whole. They also established a 5-year agreement to be able to address the tribe's needs, but this created really big impacts, not only for the Havasupai tribe, but across all of Native America. And that's because the direct benefit for the community and the tribe that was participating was very questionable. And this had impacts on not just the trust of participating in health research, but also individuals became really afraid to seek appropriate medical or diagnostic care. Thinking about diabetes, if you're not seeking healthcare at appropriate times, this really creates even more severe health implications, such as not getting kidney care, renal care as needed. So this creates even more distrust of health services, and this has had waves even beyond this Havasupai tribe to other Native Americans and Native American tribes in the United States, and created stigma for the tribe itself because of the topics that were examined, but also emotional and mental anguish. So Indigenous data sovereignty is coming out of this, and it's recognizing, along with Indigenous nation sovereignty, that Indigenous nations have sovereignty over their data. So the right of the data sovereignty is the right of a nation to govern the collection, ownership, application of its own data, and it derives from tribes' inherent right to govern their people's land and resources. So it's this extension of Indigenous sovereignty. And as you can see, the OCAP principles are really aligning and in line with this idea of data sovereignty and understanding the different dimensions that are needed to support that data sovereignty. So what is notable from this case is also understanding what is very different with Indigenous communities is getting collective informed consent of the tribe, not just individual informed consent, but first getting the communities to agree to the research. And this often means through tribal resolution and memoranda of understanding to create these good relationships. And remember, reconciliation is all about having these good relationships between Indigenous nations and others on this territory. So mechanisms for this agreement, as I mentioned, are community research agreements and memoranda of understanding that are including and outlining the data ownership procedures, but also about how research is going to work in partnership with Native American communities. And so approval for Native American research extends beyond the, the basic institutional review board review and includes tribal consent or approval. And this is also could include the Indian Health Service IRB in the United States side. This is particularly for any research conducted in IHS facilities or with IHS staff and resources, depending on the project, and additional IRBs as depending on which tribe is involved. So what can we do to support data sovereignty and out of recognition of this history and creating these better relationships with Indigenous communities? First, we can ensure that we're meaningfully engaging BIPOC communities in the development of research, and that we're engaging Indigenous nations and communities in particular on a nation-to-nation basis. So that's part of that sovereignty, that they are not just communities, they are independent nations, and working with them in a way that respects their sovereignty and their ownership of their data. And it also, what I'll be talking about next is participatory approaches and qualitative methods, and how they can be helping to support these improved relationships with Indigenous communities and stronger science. So the history of Indigenous peoples, of research with Indigenous peoples, rather, I'll talk about first. And up until recently, research with the Indigenous peoples has been done, research has been done on communities rather than in partnership with. And it was called helicopter research often because it's this metaphor that, you know, the researcher is flying into these communities, dropping in, collecting data, and then taking off in their helicopter, never to be seen or heard from again. And communities would be very upset that, you know, they would do these anthropological interviews or surveys, and they would never see any community benefit. They would never even see the findings of this research, but the researcher would, you know, benefit themselves in their career through collecting this information for generalized knowledge, but nothing to pay back the communities who participated. So it's really this extractive model of doing research with communities. And so in response, there has been this shift to community-based participatory research approaches, which involves including communities in equitable ways throughout the research process, and includes centering Indigenous knowledge and experience rather than imposing or confirming external hypotheses. So it's really working in partnership with communities as opposed to research on or of communities. So CBPR involves community members throughout the research stages, from even from problem identification to data collection, analysis and interpretation, and taking action. And an emphasis is on understanding local context and history, and shifting those power dynamics to include communities as equal partners as much as possible. So principles of CBPR include that it acknowledges community as a unit of identity, that it and is therefore also ensuring appropriate consent of that community in the research. It builds on community strengths and resources, so is a more of a strength-based approach, and facilitates collaborative and equitable partnership throughout the research. It fosters co-learning and capacity building among all partners. So that includes researchers. You know, we're not just there to, you know, teach other people, but it's about all parties learning from each other and recognizing community members as being experts in their experience and experts in their community. It also emphasizes balance between knowledge generation and intervention, so that communities also need to see a benefit, and it's not enough to just learn about a phenomenon or a health problem, but we need to find ways to address these health problems. It focuses on the local relevance of public health problems and using ecological perspectives, so understanding the role of broader environments on health, and involves partnership and development using an iterative and cyclical process. It disseminates risk to all partners and involves them in dissemination, and is committed to sustainability. So it's, you know, beyond just one individual research question, but developing these long-term relationships with communities. And this is, I think, a really great excerpt from Linda Tuhiwai Smith, who's one of the leaders in decolonizing methodologies. And this, if you haven't read this text, it's really a foundation for decolonizing approaches and participatory methods with Indigenous communities. And this quote is, when Indigenous peoples become the researchers and not merely the researched, the activity of research is transformed. Questions are framed differently, priorities are ranked differently, problems are defined differently, and people can participate on different terms. So you can see how this is the emphasis on shifting these power dynamics. And first, to shift these power dynamics, we need to understand that universities and research institutions were established, as part of colonialism. So they are upholding, they were founded as part of upholding these things like colonialism and white superiority. And, unfortunately, we see echoes of this today. And that is part of why decolonizing research approaches is meaning we're changing these power dynamics so that researchers are not in complete control of the research process. And this means really better quality research as well. So we're aiming to involve Indigenous knowledge systems on par with scientific knowledge systems. And in terms of justice, which is one of the ethical principles we follow as part of the Belmont report, that we're equitably distributing the benefits of this research, right? So it's not, and so considering communities as needing that benefit as well. So the process is, and the way that we work with communities is as important as our findings. So not just about generalizing or getting generalizable findings, but how are we working with communities to change these dynamics? And part of this is recognizing that science is not value free and is informed by our histories and positionalities, or how we all relate to that research topic that we care so much about. And that brings us to qualitative research. So qualitative research, I'm sure some of you have heard of it before, but just so we're all on the same page, as opposed to analysis of numerical data, it's analysis of textual data to identify themes, and is focusing really on the experiences, the concepts and processes of a particular phenomenon. And I think why it's so powerful is that human behavior, humans are social, right? We're so understanding that social, these broader spheres of influence and broader determinants of health will help us understand what is impacting health behaviors, and also therefore get us closer to understanding how to change those behaviors. So some of the strengths of qualitative research are, we're really getting this rich understanding of a complex phenomenon rather than, reducing things too early, which is kind of risky sometimes when we're operating with categorical data, right? Even if you go from continuous to categorical data, you're losing so much nuance. And similarly with qualitative research, if you explore experiences, processes of a phenomenon, then we can get more of an understanding of how to measure these things better. We can collect data in a more flexible way because we're not saying, use this Likert response or yes, no. We're more wanting to get that richness and depth. It situates participants as experts. So getting a little bit more at that equal power dynamic where we as researchers are trying to learn from others as opposed to having all the answers. It's a very culturally appropriate way to work in Indigenous communities is, first you go out and you talk to people, especially elders, to understand what's already being done and what is the current knowledge, and can allow and facilitate the strength-based understanding. It can also facilitate understanding the interactions between people and their environments, as I mentioned before, that placing these behaviors in these complex social environments, and can really be powerful for understanding ways that we can intervene by incorporating these community perspectives so that the interventions that we develop are based on what people really experience and real needs in the community rather than what we think is needed as interventionists or as health experts. And so it's getting back to this quote that I'm sure everyone has encountered before, but not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. So of course, I'm particularly interested in obesity prevention. And it's not only about, of course, like the kind of food that you eat, but it's our relationships to these foods. So in Indigenous communities, it's everything is about our relationships to these different parts of our food environments and the meanings that they have, and about these relationships being reciprocal. So you see some pictures of harvesting black walnuts in the center, of hunting moose, and strawberry plant on the right. So it's all about these understanding these complex ways that we interact with our environment, and going beyond just the numbers, which cannot capture these relationships and the meaning of these relationships. So combining approaches is really looking at the ways that these mixed methods can really complement what we're doing in an epidemiologic study, where, in epi, we're trying to understand associations, or understanding the prevalence of a particular health phenomenon, understanding risk factors. So the patterns that we are getting and analyzing are, of course, focusing on percentages, averages, and associations. But with qualitative research, we're really complementing this approach, and trying to understand, well, what is the experience around this phenomenon? What are the processes that facilitate this phenomenon from happening? How do we develop a conceptual framework? And there are a lot of ways that can complement epidemiologic research. So similar to quantitative and epidemiologic analysis of patterns, qualitative research is also looking at patterns and looking at description of themes, and identifying supporting quotes for themes around a particular topic of study. So mixed methods can be very powerful way to get a more holistic understanding, to also listen to communities, and an approach to potentially better balance that equal partnership approach with communities. And of course, there are different ways of combining qualitative and quantitative methods in your mixed methods design through sequential explanatory design. So, you get a really intriguing finding in your epidemiologic study, in your cohort study, for example, and you're trying to understand, well, what are the social processes that are going through this? What are the mechanisms? So you can design qualitative research to explain your quantitative findings. You could do qualitative first to inform your quantitative survey, for example. So, maybe there isn't a good way to measure a particular thing, or it hasn't been developed in a specific population. You could do qualitative research first to understand that. And of course, you can also have them simultaneously informing different dimensions of the same research question, even, like is better depicted on this slide. So strong qualitative research is coming from a different philosophical stance as opposed to epi. So, we're aiming for depth rather than breadth. So the sampling is not the same. We're not aiming for random selection, but we're aiming to interview people and collect data with people who are experts in a topic. So similar to understanding, racism, it's not really effective to do a random survey to understand the experience of racism or prevalence of racism. But, to understand the experience of racism, we need to talk to the people who experience it, right? So it's a different approach, a different philosophy, and therefore a different approach for conducting that research. And compared to accuracy and the criteria for rigorous research and quantitative, we need to shift our perspective of the way we evaluate qualitative research. So findings, we aim for our findings to be trustworthy, and this is from Lincoln and Guba. So we aim for our qualitative research to be credible, so that there is a fit between what the participants are saying and what the researchers say. We're hoping for dependable findings, so we document, we have a logical research process. We're documenting that process, and the researcher is not overly influencing the results. We are aiming for confirmable findings, so it's not just one kind of person, but we're triangulating from different groups and documenting the process, the research process. And as opposed to generalizability, we're aiming for transferable findings. So providing a rich enough explanation of the qualitative findings so that people can read our study and say, judge for themselves whether it would transfer to their particular circumstances or population and topic area. And of course, it aligns well with the CBPR principles that I talked about. You can, depending on how you collect the data and design the study, be more strength-based, situate communities as experts. But of course, that also, relies on your the way you design the study and proceed with the data collection. So some challenges of qualitative and mixed methods and incorporating that is that researchers really need to have adequate expertise. I think sometimes people don't realize how much it takes to design a really strong qualitative study and the different techniques and skills that are needed to develop and conduct a study. And part of that is understanding these different epistemological foundations for the research, including the central role of reflexivity or understanding our positionality in the research and how we use that as a way to ensure we have very trustworthy findings, and understanding how we evaluate the rigor of qualitative methods. It takes quite a bit of time in collecting and rigorously analyzing qualitative data, and is expensive as well because, transcription is very time intensive if you're doing it yourself, or very costly if you're submitting for transcription services. And also there's challenges of publishing mixed methods because, especially with the qualitative piece, you have to summarize everything in very short spaces for most mixed methods papers. So now that I've kind of talked about these ways that we can incorporate, think about this history of Indigenous populations, of their sovereignty, supporting their data sovereignty through incorporation of participatory and qualitative approaches, I'm now going to talk about an example, right? Like, I think it sounds, how are we supposed to do this? And I'm going to give an example of one study that I'm very fortunate to be working on. So this study is really looking at the context of traditional food systems, having this very complicated modern food system, which incorporates both traditional foods and contemporary food systems, and this high access to ultra processed foods on reservation, which tend to be very rural communities, and having to travel farther and pay more for healthy foods. So to understand these complex food systems that are including both contemporary, grocery stores, traditional food access, alternative food sources, including, emergency and support programs. In Canada, there's a great need for nutrition information. So first, the diet of First Nations children and youth living on reserve is unknown. There is the Canadian Community Health Survey collects data similar to other surveillance like FEHNCY. It regularly collects information throughout Canada, but it does not include on-reserve communities, which of course is a real problem. And this is also common in the United States. There aren't good data sources. And we also need to understand, how do we engage communities in this process? So the Food, Environment, Health, and Nutrition of First Nations Children and Youth study, FEHNCY, is designed to assess the relationship between nutrition and the built social and natural environments, and how they impact the health of First Nations children and youth living on reserve. So this is a survey that is being done across Canada over the next 10 years, and will include 60 randomly selected First Nations communities in a survey, but it's also a mixed method study. And the ultimate goal is to ultimately develop policy and programmatic recommendations for addressing the health needs of First Nations children and youth living on reserve, and build capacity of these communities. And this is through, this study has many different PIs across University of Ottawa. The lead PI is Dr. Laurie Chen, University of Laval, Health Canada, McGill University, including me and others at McGill University, the Assembly of First Nations, University of Montreal, and in partnership with the participating First Nations communities. There are 4 components of this study. So the first component is looking at the food environment and nutrition. Second component is looking at housing conditions, indoor air quality, and respiratory health. The third component is actually a biosample, including blood, urine, and hair samples, which I mentioned are very sensitive, and looking at social determinants of health and health status. And the last component is community mobilization and community engagement, which is the component that I lead along with Dr. Trina Delormier, who is another Mohawk researcher at McGill. So this community engagement and mobilization component is aimed to support the translation of the FEHNCY study findings into policy and programmatic change by supporting meaningful engagement of participating communities. And we focus on developing and maintaining strong relationships with the participating communities. So we first recruit at the community level. We send letters through our partner, the Assembly of First Nations. We provide community presentations, and we have a community research agreement, a funding transfer agreement, and a band council resolution that we work with each community to develop. Then, we focus on building relationships and building trust with communities. And that's through co-learning workshops so that we learn from communities. We include incorporation of Indigenous ceremony through opening celebrations and feasts. We make sure we are giving regular community presentations and establish community advisory circles to inform the way that we work with community. We aim to maintain these respectful relationships by hearing from community perspectives. So we have participatory mapping, which is a qualitative component with children and youth. We do in-depth interviews with key food experts in the community, and we assess access to healthy foods through community food environment observations and maps that we develop with the community. So this is an example of what participatory mapping with children and youth can look like, and can really facilitate interesting discussion with children and youth, and important to hear their perspectives along with getting that quantitative data about their regular food intake and understanding these food practices. As I mentioned, we also do in-depth interviews, about 12 to 15 in each community, to understand traditional as well as store-bought food access. And then we work to communicate, disseminate results to communities, and interpret them with communities and apply knowledge. So we give report cards back to participants in the survey. We discuss priorities and recommendations for action with communities, and we ensure that we are doing those community dissemination activities, as well as a closing celebration and feast, recognizing those Indigenous knowledge systems and ways of maintaining these good relationships. So the FEHNCY study will be one of the first to comprehensively assess the food environments, food security, nutrition, housing and indoor air quality, environmental contaminants exposure, and health indicators of First Nations living on reserve. And first to really examine how we can work in the context of this rigorous representative survey meaningfully engage Indigenous communities. And really, I think it's just such a really amazing project to be a part of, and to get to work on these pieces and incorporate ways to these participatory approaches to involve communities, incorporate qualitative methods and participatory approaches. I know I just went a few minutes late, but really want to say Nyawakoa, many thanks for having me, and really look forward to hearing your questions.
Thanks for that great presentation, Brittany. If anyone has any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat or ask them here. I know we got a comment earlier from Rebecca Conway about the quality of the presentation, and that it's a good, great quality.
Oh, thanks. Sorry, I didn't catch that earlier.
No, you're welcome. I thought it was awesome.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi,
Brittany.
I have a question. Oh, sorry, somebody else I heard speaking.
That's okay, Sarah. Go ahead. I'll go next.
Okay, thanks. Hi, I had a friend send this presentation to me. Thank you so much, Brittany. I really appreciated this. I'm actually based in Hawaii. I work at a comprehensive health center here. And a lot of what you're talking about, it reminds me of research method that we use here. We call it uluhoku, and it's about constellating, you know, using the qualitative data, but then also the quantitative data to tell this richer story. And I guess I kind of wanted to talk to you a little bit about something you just briefly touched about, and just, sorry, there's the intercom, about qualitative data, and I guess why it isn't, for lack of a better word, appreciated more than maybe it should be, or where you think we are in terms of sort of qualitative data having a deeper impact.
Yeah, so your question was about, you know, kind of why qualitative isn't valued as much. I think part of that is coming from the different philosophical underpinnings of it. So I think, you know, what tends to be valued is objective science, right? This coming from this positivist epistemology, which, you know, it is very valuable, but at the same time, you know, it depends on the research question. So there's an epistemology that is pragmatism, and you know, it's really saying that, and it's often used for mixed methods, that, you know, the methods that I'm going to use depends on the question, which makes a lot of sense, right? Like I'm gonna design the methods based on that fits the research question most. So if you were to ask me, like, if the research question is how many people are attending this seminar, like my method is counting, it should be reproducible, and because there's one objective answer, right? But, you know, a different question that we could ask related to that is, you know, what is the experience of people attending this EPI seminar? And that would be a very different approach to understanding that, right? So I would adopt this stance of, you know, that you know, that we cannot be objective because we're instruments in the data collection process, that I can't separate, right? You can't have a conversation with a person and then just delete all the things that I say. That's really misleading, right? You're responding to what I'm saying. So I think it's, you know, part of the misunderstanding of it is not understanding these philosophical differences, which, you know, have echoes in how you communicate and value the research.
Thank you.
That helps answer.
Yeah, it's a one of those, there's an advocacy piece to it, you know, and so yeah, I think there's that work for all of us to do.
Yeah, and I think in terms of advocacy and how we support strong advocacy for policy is that stories are very powerful in addition to numbers. It is very powerful when you combine both, because it's not only, you know, how many people are experiencing a problem, what is the risk factor, but, you know, what is the real life experience. And we see that all the time, even, you know, when we're even looking at the State of the Union address, they always have people stand up, you know, to tell their story and incorporate that into the data, and that also fits with advocating for policy and programmatic change as well.
Thank you so much.
Hi, Brittany. Lisa Miller from the School of Public Health. I so agree with Rebecca. Great talk, and also so applicable, I think, to so many different communities. I wonder if you could talk about the funding, because it seems like it has to start almost this attitude with the funder. So the funder has to incorporate the communities in order to make sure that the topics being funded are the ones that are important to the community, right? And the methods that are, you know, funded need to be certain methods. So in Canada, does it start with the funders, and have they, you know, is there a recognition at that level of what needs to happen?
Yeah, and I think there is movement on the United States side through NIH in recognizing and evaluating participatory research. So, you know, you can submit funding, an R01 funding for participatory research, and they have really good evaluation. You know, if you're not submitting with a letter of support from a tribe, you know, it's not going to be very successful. I've had experience with that. And so you need to do a lot of work to be able to even submit a grant. That's also the case with the Canadian side, and they are starting to change some of the ways that research is developed. So recognizing that it does take time to develop grants, they are starting to incorporate development grants. So it's like another round in the application process. There are some shifts happening in both the US and Canadian sides.
I think we had a question by Andrea Lend asking, should qualitative data collection and analysis skills be taught in epidemiology programs, or should qualitative insights be pursued through collaborations?
Yeah, and you know, that's a really great question. I think what epidemiology, I think there's a lot to learn even in one epi program, learning all of the required methods. I think it would be a lot to add on qualitative. It's really another degree. But I think what should be taught in epidemiologic schools is more of an understanding for what mixed methods is, these philosophical traditions, because that will facilitate collaborations. Like if you're not going to value or understand how to, you know, evaluate qualitative research appropriately, then it's going to be pretty hard to develop respectful collaborations with qualitative researchers. So I think being able to, you know, talk about those philosophical backgrounds and how to evaluate them would be really a great way to incorporate into EPI programs. Because I think, you know, on the extreme end, I think sometimes people think qualitative is like journalism, you know, and of course it is a science. It's coming from the social sciences, but, you know, it's a systematic way of collecting data similar to EPI, but you evaluate it in very different ways because of that epistemological stance that is so different.
This is new. I wanted to really thank you for this talk. It was really amazing. And also kind of build a little bit on what Dr. Miller was talking about, which is, are there any funding sources in which communities can initiate the research? You know, I know like we've talked about how researchers have to collaborate with communities, but is there any way that if a community recognizes, look, we need to do this, what are the options that they have to actually research it, start research or get the funds to do that? Because I think that would go a long ways towards decolonizing research.
That's a really great question. There are funding mechanisms that are available to tribes specifically, or to communities and not to institutions. But one of the challenges is that, you know, what things count in academia for researchers, right? And so for research to be valued, it has to be in some ways driven by the researcher, right? Because then we get more credit when we have those dollars, right? When we're in charge of that money. So there is quite a bit written from participatory research advocating for these changes that are needed in the academy to be able to really facilitate you know, better relationships, and a lot of discussion around being able to have more money go directly to communities. So there are different funding mechanisms, but it's also institutional changes that need to happen and are starting to happen. At least conversations around what needs to happen. Yeah.
All right. Well, we're at 1 o'clock. Thank you everybody for attending, and thank you again, Brittany,